From the battlefields of Europe to the deserts of Egypt, from clandestine SS commando raids to whispered dealings with Mossad, Otto Skorzeny's life reads like something torn from a spy novel. When you check his Wikipedia page, you think, what the hell? Israel and SS together? Like, this is insane. He was the man who freed Mussolini from captivity, who ran deception missions in the Ardennes, who built secret escape networks for fugitives after the war, and who later surfaced in the unlikeliest corners of the Cold War world. His journey did not end with 1945. It only became stranger. This is his full story, the epic wartime ventures of Otto Skorzeny and the extraordinary post-war life that followed. Otto Skorzeny, a name that would later become well known in military history, entered the world on June 12, 1908 in Vienna. At that time, Vienna was not only the cultural and political heart of Austria, but also the capital of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire, a multi-ethnic realm stretching across much of Central and Southeastern Europe. His father, Anton Skorzeny, was an experienced engineer and architect in his late 30s when Otto was born. The family surname hinted at distant roots in northern Poland, specifically from the village of Skorzeny in eastern Pomerania. Otto's mother, Flora, came from a background with more Central European and Germanic heritage, her maiden name being Sieber Steiner Hart. By the early 20th century, the Skorzenys were comfortably established. Anton had built a successful construction business, and both sides of the family maintained strong ties to the Austro-Hungarian tradition of military service. Several generations of Flora's relatives had served in the Habsburg armies, and this legacy continued when Anton, as a reserve artillery officer, was called up to fight for the empire at the outbreak of the First World War. Otto was just 6 years old when his father went to the front. The war years left a deep impression on the young boy. Like countless families across the empire, the Skorzenys faced the uncertainty and hardship brought by the conflict. When the fighting ended in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated, replaced by a patchwork of new states that resembled the modern map of Central Europe. Austria was reduced to a small landlocked republic, facing severe economic and political challenges in the years that followed. In school, Otto gravitated toward practical subjects. He excelled in mathematics and engineering and showed a natural ability with foreign languages. Literature and the humanities held little appeal for him, and he read mainly for study rather than pleasure. In 1926, following in the footsteps of his father and older brother Alfred, Otto enrolled at the Technische Hochschule in Vienna to study engineering. He would spend years there, first earning his degree and then continuing on to advanced studies. During his time at the university, one of his passions was fencing, a sport steeped in tradition among European students. It was in one of these fencing duels that Otto received the distinctive scar on his cheek, a mark that would give his face a rugged and instantly recognizable appearance throughout his life. While pursuing his studies, Otto also began to take a greater interest in the political climate of the time. The Austria of the late 1920s was a society divided into sharply different ideological camps. Communists who drew inspiration from the 1917 Russian Revolution, nationalist movements with varying visions for Austria's future, and other groups influenced by political developments elsewhere in Europe. In 1927, a failed communist uprising in Vienna, poorly organized and swiftly suppressed, stirred public anxiety and fueled political polarization. Among the nationalist student movements that gained traction was the Academic Legion, a paramilitary association of university students that Otto joined in 1928. This group was linked to the larger Heimwehr, or Home Guard, a nationalist paramilitary force active across Austria. By the early 1930s, the Heimwehr had cultivated ties with nationalist governments in Italy under Mussolini and in Hungary under Regent Miklos Horthy, as well as with the growing National Socialist movement in Germany. Otto's involvement deepened, and by 1931 he had risen to the role of platoon leader within the Heimwehr. However, the Heimwehr's fortunes declined sharply after a failed attempt to stage a March on Vienna in 1931, intended to mirror Mussolini's March on Rome nearly a decade earlier. The poorly executed move led by Walter Freimer, head of the Heimwehr's pan-German faction, fizzled without significant public support, damaging the group's credibility. Many of its members, looking for a more dynamic movement, shifted their allegiance to the Austrian branch of the Nazi Party. At this time, political change was sweeping Germany. The economic devastation of the Great Depression, following the Wall Street crash of 1929, had fueled growing support for extremist parties. The National Socialists, once a fringe movement, rapidly gained influence, culminating in Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany in early 1933. Back in Austria, Otto completed his thesis, titled The Calculation and Construction of a Diesel Engine, and became more actively involved with the Austrian Nazis. He joined the party on May 1st, 1932, inspired after hearing a speech by Joseph Goebbels during a visit to Vienna. But the political environment in Austria shifted quickly. Less than 3 months later, Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss outlawed the Nazi Party in Austria, promoting instead a new state ideology known as the Fatherland Front, a form of Austrian nationalism that rejected any political union with Germany. Over the next 2 years, the Austrian Nazis launched a determined campaign to challenge the government, often using Bavaria as their base of operations just across the border. In the immediate years that followed, the Fatherland Front government managed to hold back the first wave of efforts to unite Austria with Germany under the Nazi banner. Yet this was only a temporary pause in a much larger political struggle. With the Nazi Party outlawed in Austria, the country entered a period of political uncertainty, and in this environment, Otto Skorzeny began carving out his place in civilian life after completing his studies. His first job was modest, working in a garage, but before long he secured a more lucrative role at Meidlinger Gerüstbau, a Vienna-based construction and scaffolding company. His connection to the business was personal as well as professional. Since 1930, he had been in a relationship with the company owner's daughter, Margareta Schreiber. The two married in the summer of 1934, and Skorzeny began working directly under his father-in-law. Over the next few years, his standing in the company grew, and he acquired a stake in the business. The marriage, however, did not last. In 1937, after 7 years together, Otto divorced Margareta and soon married again, this time to Emmy Linhart. It was with Emmy that he would have his only child, a daughter named Waltraud, born in 1940. By the time of his second marriage, Austria's political situation had changed dramatically. Throughout the mid-1930s, Germany had embarked on an ambitious program of rearmament and expansion, and in 1937, Hitler intensified pressure on the Austrian government. This culminated in March 1938 with the Anschluss, the unification of Austria and Germany. German forces crossed the border and took control without resistance, and Austria was formally absorbed into the Reich. Skorzeny's exact role in these events remains uncertain. In his memoirs, he claimed that he personally intervened to prevent the Austrian president, Wilhelm Miklas, from being shot during the takeover, though there is no solid evidence to verify this account. What is more firmly established is that later that same year, he took part in one of the most infamous events in pre-war Nazi Germany, the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht. Across Germany and Austria, Jewish homes, businesses, and places of worship were attacked. In Vienna, Skorzeny, by then an SS member, is believed to have been involved in assaults on at least 2 synagogues. By late 1938, Nazi Germany's confidence on the world stage was growing rapidly. The regime had already defied the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles through large-scale rearmament, and now it was openly redrawing the map of Central Europe. Following Austria's annexation came the absorption of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia in October 1938. Within months, the rest of Czechoslovakia was occupied, and in March 1939 the port city of Memel in present-day Lithuania was taken. The pace of these territorial expansions alarmed Britain and France, which began urgent preparations for the possibility of a larger war. Tensions reached a breaking point over Poland. Hitler's government had been making increasingly bold demands for territory, and when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, after staging a border incident to portray Poland as the aggressor, Britain and France responded by declaring war 2 days later. Europe was once again at war and the Second World War had begun. With the outbreak of hostilities, Skorzeny left his civilian career behind and volunteered for military service. Despite his party membership and SS affiliation, he had no actual combat experience at this stage. Physically, he was striking, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and athletic from years of sport, but in the eyes of the Vienna recruitment authorities, his age of 31 placed him outside the first wave of conscripts. He next tried to join the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force commanded by Hermann Göring, but his height proved a disadvantage. Fighter aircraft simply could not accommodate a man of his size. Instead, he was assigned to a military communications depot in Vienna, an administrative role that he found dull and frustrating. For the first several months of the war, right into early 1940, this was where Skorzeny remained, far from the front lines where events were beginning to accelerate. By the spring of 1940, an opportunity arose for Otto Skorzeny to step away from the office-bound work he disliked and into an active military role. Already a member of the SS, he learned that the Waffen-SS, the armed, combat-oriented branch of the organization, was expanding rapidly and seeking new officers. With his engineering background and interest in mechanics, Skorzeny believed he could be of particular value, especially as this force was beginning to operate heavily armored units, including tanks and other mechanized formations. He applied and was accepted, beginning his formal training with the Waffen-SS in the spring of 1940. His entry into active service coincided with a pivotal period in the war. After the swift conquest of Poland in September 1939, the winter months had passed with relatively little fighting in the West, a period that became known as the Phony War. This quiet was broken in April 1940 when Germany moved against neutral Denmark and Norway, securing both with remarkable speed. Only a month later came one of the most significant offensives of the war so far. The invasion of the Low Countries and northern France in May 1940. Armoured thrusts and coordinated air power quickly overwhelmed Allied forces, forcing the British to evacuate from Dunkirk and leaving France effectively defeated within weeks. By June, Paris was under German occupation, and Britain stood alone in Western Europe. The following months brought the aerial bombardment of Britain, the Blitz, and a naval blockade designed to pressure Prime Minister Winston Churchill into negotiation. But rather than focus solely on Britain, Hitler made a strategic shift. In 1941, attention turned eastward toward the Soviet Union, a decision that would open a far larger and more brutal front. Before that campaign began, however, the German leadership moved to secure its southern flank. In April 1941, German forces entered Yugoslavia and Greece to stabilize the Balkans ahead of the planned eastern offensive. Skorzeny took part in these operations, though his role was relatively limited, serving mainly with the supply and support elements of the force. There were brief engagements with Serbian forces, but nothing compared to the large-scale combat that lay ahead. During this period, while traveling and awaiting further deployment, Skorzeny was reading T.E. Lawrence's The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. This was unusual for him. He was not known for reading extensively, but the exploits of Lawrence of Arabia during the First World War seemed to resonate with his developing sense of military ambition. Within a short time, he would find himself in command roles that demanded similar initiative and adaptability. By the summer of 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in recorded history. Around 3 million Axis troops crossed into the Soviet Union, advancing along 3 major fronts toward Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kiev in the south. Skorzeny was now serving with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, positioned along the central thrust aimed at Moscow. The early stages of the offensive brought rapid gains. The Red Army, caught off guard and still recovering from years of internal purges, suffered heavy losses in both manpower and equipment. By late September 1941, German forces had reached the approaches to the Soviet capital. Skorzeny's unit, part of the division's motorized formations, was designated as an advance element for the expected capture of the city. His specific orders included securing key strategic buildings, among them the Lubyanka, a late 19th century structure that the Soviet government had turned into the headquarters of its intelligence services. Those plans for Moscow never came to fruition. As winter closed in during late 1941, the German advance stalled on the outskirts of the city. Freezing temperatures, supply shortages, and fierce Soviet counterattacks slowly forced the Wehrmacht into retreat. In the latter stages of the battle, Skorzeny was wounded when a fragment of shrapnel struck the back of his head. Though the injury was not fatal, it was serious enough to see him evacuated from the front. After initial treatment, he was sent to Berlin to recover. It was during this period of convalescence that an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Within the German High Command, discussions were underway about forming an elite special operations force, a dedicated commando-style unit capable of executing unconventional missions deep behind enemy lines. The British had already demonstrated the effectiveness of such forces in 1940 and 1941, conducting raids against German and Italian positions in occupied Europe, Norway, and North Africa. These operations, often small in scale but high in impact, showed that targeted strikes by highly trained operatives could achieve results that conventional armies might struggle to accomplish. Germany had experimented with similar formations earlier in the war. The most notable was the Brandenburg Regiment, an army unit specializing in reconnaissance, sabotage, and infiltration. However, by early 1942, plans emerged for a new SS-based unit that could carry out such missions under direct control of the Waffen-SS leadership. This new formation was to be known as Sonderlehrgang Oranienburg, the Special Training Course Oranienburg, initially composed of around 300 men drawn from the Waffen-SS. The project was overseen by Hans Juttner, a senior SS official with strong administrative skills but no frontline military experience. Recognizing this gap, Juttner sought an officer who not only understood military operations but also had the drive to build a unit from the ground up. Recommendations soon pointed him toward Otto Skorzeny, who was still recuperating in Berlin. Skorzeny had already voiced interest in forming a special operations detachment and was seen as a candidate with the technical knowledge, organizational ability, and personal determination to make it work. In the spring of 1942, Skorzeny was appointed commander of the new Special Operations Unit. The remainder of that year was spent shaping the force, selecting suitable men, overseeing their training, and refining their skills for missions that would demand adaptability, stealth, and precision. The training program included advanced weapons handling, demolitions, navigation, survival skills, and tactics for operating in enemy territory. Even as the unit was being forged, German planners were already considering potential missions. One of the earliest concepts was Operation Osprey, a contingency plan born from the shifting dynamics of the war. Following the United States' entry into the conflict in December 1941, American troops had been stationed in Northern Ireland, while both British and American forces also occupied neutral Iceland. This raised concerns in Berlin that the Allies might attempt to occupy the rest of Ireland, the independent republic, in order to secure its ports and airfields. Operation Osprey envisioned a rapid German response if such an occupation took place. Special operatives from Skorzeny's unit would be parachuted into Ireland to make contact with local resistance elements, particularly within the Irish Republican Army. Their role would be to provide training, logistical support, and coordination for sabotage and guerrilla activities against any occupying Allied forces. The plan was an extension of earlier German thinking about exploiting Irish resistance to British influence. In the end, while Britain and the United States seriously considered such an invasion, they decided against it, and Operation Osprey was never launched. However, the concept reflected the kind of missions Skorzeny's unit was expected to undertake. Small, specialized deployments aimed at destabilizing enemy operations and supporting local resistance movements far from the main battlefronts. One of the most striking examples came from Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who devised a mission codenamed Operation Ulm. The idea was for Skorzeny's commandos to strike deep into Soviet territory and destroy key industrial facilities that had been relocated east of the Ural Mountains. These factories had been moved en masse at the start of the German invasion to keep them beyond the reach of advancing troops, and by 1942 they were producing vast quantities of weapons and equipment for the Red Army. The concept, however, was logistically impossible. The distances involved, the lack of airlift capability, and the sheer depth of Soviet defenses made such a raid more fantasy than feasible plan. Despite this, Himmler persisted with the idea well into 1943, abandoning it only when the strategic situation in the east had shifted dramatically and German forces were being driven steadily back toward their own borders. A more grounded proposal was Operation Franz, aimed at supporting anti-British and anti-Soviet groups in Iran, particularly the Qashqai tribes of the south. This region held immense strategic value. Iranian oil was a critical resource for the Allies, and the country was a key transit point for American-built weapons and vehicles traveling north via the Persian corridor to supply the Soviet war effort. If the Qashqai could be encouraged and supported in disrupting these routes, it could have caused significant delays and complications for Allied logistics. The plan called for German operatives to make contact with the tribes and provide arms, equipment and training. However, the mission quickly ran into setbacks. Only a single commando unit managed to reach Iran, and much of their equipment never even left Europe, lost on a runway in Crimea before departure. In the end, Operation Franz achieved nothing of substance, but it provided valuable experience in the kind of logistical challenges such missions faced, lessons that would be applied to more successful operations later in the war. It was in 1943 that the mission which would cement Skorzeny's reputation was put into motion. The strategic situation for Germany had taken a sharp turn for the worse. That spring, in North Africa, the Axis position collapsed entirely. The remaining German and Italian forces surrendered in Tunisia, ending the campaign and giving the Allies control of the southern Mediterranean. This allowed them to open a new front in Europe, beginning with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. The fighting there lasted barely a month. The Allies secured the island and then crossed to the Italian mainland in early September. The defeats shook the Italian leadership, and on July 25, 1943, even before the mainland invasion, a political coup unfolded in Rome. Benito Mussolini, Italy's long-standing fascist leader, was deposed by members of his own government and placed under arrest on the orders of King Victor Emmanuel III. In the weeks that followed, the new Italian administration sought a way out of the war. By early September, they had negotiated and signed an armistice with the Allies, switching sides and plunging Italy into political and military chaos. By late summer 1943, Hitler was faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation in Italy. The fall of Sicily, the Allied landing on the mainland, and Mussolini's removal from power meant that the road north toward Austria and southern Germany lay dangerously exposed. To prevent a swift Allied push into Central Europe, he ordered tens of thousands of German troops into northern Italy, seizing control of key cities and defensive lines. However, military control alone was not enough. For political purposes, Berlin wanted to maintain at least the appearance of legitimacy for its occupation of northern and central Italy. The solution was to re-establish Mussolini as the head of a new regime, one that would operate under German supervision. The challenge was that Mussolini was now a prisoner, held in strict isolation by his former allies. A daring rescue would be required, and Hitler selected Otto Skorzeny for the task. Since his arrest on July 25th, Mussolini had been moved between several secure locations in central Italy, as his captors sought to keep him hidden from German intelligence. Eventually, they decided on a remote and easily defensible site, the Hotel Campo Imperatore, perched high on an isolated plateau in the Gran Sasso range of the Apennine Mountains. At over 2,000 meters above sea level, the hotel was accessible only by a single cable car. The location had been chosen precisely because it was almost impossible to approach without being detected. In the early autumn of 1943, Skorzeny began formulating his plan. Weeks were spent gathering intelligence, assessing the terrain, and considering possible approaches. He held lengthy discussions with both Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, each eager to associate themselves with any success the mission might bring. The operation was scheduled for September 12th, by which time the German advance from the north had already retaken Rome and dismantled what remained of the Italian administration that had switched sides to the Allies. With Gran Sasso now relatively close to the German lines, the raid could be launched directly from the capital. Just after midday on September 12th, Skorzeny and his selected force departed Rome in a formation of Henschel H-126 reconnaissance aircraft, each towing a DFS-230 assault glider. The DFS-230 was a compact but wide-winged craft, able to carry a 9-man assault team along with their equipment. The plan called for 10 gliders, around 90 men in total, made up of both Luftwaffe Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, and Skorzeny's SS troops. The flight over the rugged Apennines took just over an hour. Shortly after 1400, the gliders swooped onto the small grassy plateau near the hotel. One glider struck the ground hard and crashed, injuring several men, but the rest landed successfully. Roughly 85 operatives pressed forward toward the hotel. Meanwhile, another detachment of Fallschirmjäger had landed in the valley below. Their objective was to capture the lower cable car station, the only direct link between the hotel and the surrounding region, and cut the telephone lines to prevent any alarm from spreading. This simultaneous move effectively sealed off the garrison at the top from outside communication or reinforcement. Despite the isolation, the defenders inside Hotel Campo Imperatore, around 200 carabinieri, still held a significant numerical advantage over Skorzeny's force, outnumbering them more than 2-1. The challenge now was to take control of the hotel quickly and without triggering a deadly firefight that might place Mussolini in danger. The assault on the Hotel Campo Imperatore was over almost before it began. As Skorzeny strode through the entrance with his men at his back, the Italian carabinieri inside found themselves caught off guard, uncertain how large the attacking force actually was. The sudden appearance of heavily armed German troops on the plateau, delivered by gliders in a daring and unprecedented landing, had already shaken their resolve. Adding to the confusion was the presence of General Fernando Soletti, an Italian officer and veteran of the African campaigns, who had accompanied Skorzeny on the mission. Soletti used his authority and familiarity with the carabinieri to persuade them to lay down their arms, emphasizing that further resistance was pointless and that Mussolini's safety could only be guaranteed if they cooperated. It was barely 10 minutes after touchdown, around 14:15, when Skorzeny himself stepped forward to greet the man who had once ruled Italy. Mussolini, looking older and far more fragile than the towering propaganda figure of earlier years, nevertheless straightened and smiled faintly as Skorzeny entered the room. For the German officer, it was a moment that would define his career. With minimal bloodshed, he had snatched one of Europe's most famous leaders from captivity on an isolated mountaintop, and he knew the significance this would carry, both in military and propaganda terms. But the operation was not over. For Berlin, it was not enough that Mussolini be freed. The rescue had to be seen. Propaganda officers were present and their orders were clear. Photographs and film footage must document the event from every angle. Time was spent arranging scenes outside the hotel. Skorzeny standing beside Mussolini, armed men posted in the background, the dramatic mountain scenery framing the moment. The delay was risky, as the longer they remained on the plateau, the greater the chance of Allied reconnaissance or a counterattack. The situation was further complicated by personal rivalry. Major Otto Harold Moors, commander of the Fallschirmjäger detachment that had seized the cable car station below, believed his men's role in cutting communications and securing the approach had been decisive. Skorzeny, determined to ensure the SS and Heinrich Himmler received the lion's share of the credit, decided to alter the exit plan. Instead of sending Mussolini away alone, he would accompany the former dictator himself. The waiting aircraft was a small Fieseler Fi-156 Storch, a light reconnaissance plane designed for short takeoffs and landings. With Mussolini and Skorzeny both aboard, along with the pilot, the aircraft was now dangerously overloaded. The takeoff run along the makeshift grass strip was nerve-wracking. The Storch skimmed the edge of the plateau, momentarily dipping before its wings caught the air and carried it clear of the mountain. It had been a close call, and Skorzeny's insistence on flying out with Mussolini had brought the mission to the brink of disaster. Nevertheless, the operation was declared a triumph. Mussolini was flown north and installed as head of the newly formed Italian Social Republic, a German-controlled regime based in the town of Salo. For the Axis, it restored a semblance of political continuity in northern Italy, even if Mussolini now ruled in name only. Skorzeny's role in the Gran Sasso raid was heavily publicized in the German press, ensuring that he, and by extension, the SS and Himmler, became synonymous with the mission's success. Even Winston Churchill, no friend to his enemies, described it as a raid of great daring. Yet even as the Gran Sasso operation was taking shape, Skorzeny's name had surfaced in connection with another plan, one far more audacious in its scope and potential consequences. Since the United States had entered the war in December 1941, the Allied leaders had met at carefully guarded conferences to coordinate strategy. Casablanca in January 1943, Quebec in August of the same year. Then, in the summer of 1943, German intelligence reportedly received extraordinary information. For the first time, the three most powerful Allied leaders, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, were to meet together in a single location. The chosen city was Tehran, capital of Iran, which since 1941 had been jointly occupied by Britain and the Soviet Union to safeguard its oil fields and secure vital supply routes to the USSR. For Hitler, the prospect of striking down all three Allied leaders at once was almost unthinkable in its potential impact. The plan that emerged was codenamed Operation Long Jump. If the opportunity could be seized, it could, in theory, alter the course of the war in a single blow. If Operation Long Jump truly existed as the Nazis planned to strike at the very heart of the Allied leadership, then it was an operation whose scope bordered on the unprecedented. According to accounts that emerged later, overall responsibility for the initiative was allegedly placed in the hands of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the deputy head of the SS and chief of the Reich Main Security Office. Kaltenbrunner, however, was not known for leading field operations himself. Instead, he is said to have delegated the task to a select group of trusted operatives, with Otto Skorzeny named as one of the principal figures expected to oversee its execution. To this day, historians debate whether Operation Long Jump was a concrete plan or merely an idea that never progressed beyond preliminary discussions. What is certain is that no such operation was ever carried out. When the Tehran Conference opened in late November 1943, Joseph Stalin presented evidence, allegedly gathered by Soviet intelligence, suggesting the Germans had intended to assassinate all three Allied leaders, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin himself. According to the Soviet narrative, German agents had been inserted into Tehran weeks earlier, taking up residence in hotels near the conference venue. The plan, Stalin claimed, had been exposed by NKVD counterintelligence through the work of Nikolai Kuznetsov, an operative posing as a German officer in occupied Ukraine. The Soviets maintained that this intelligence reached Berlin before the conference began, prompting the Germans to abort the mission and withdraw their operatives from the Iranian capital. If Stalin's version was accurate, then Skorzeny, already known for high-risk missions, may have been central to an operation that, had it succeeded, could have altered the course of the war in a single day. Yet the historical record is murky. In his memoirs, written in the 1950s, Skorzeny flatly denied any involvement. Other evidence suggests that while the idea of targeting the Allied leaders in Tehran may have been explored by German planners, it never moved far beyond a conceptual stage. Whether this was a missed opportunity or simply an inflated piece of wartime propaganda remains unresolved. Even as the controversy over Operation Long Jump would linger for decades, Skorzeny's attention was already shifting to another assignment, one that would be given the codename Operation Rösselsprung, or Knight's Move. This new mission aimed not at enemy heads of state, but at the most successful partisan commander in occupied Europe, Josip Broz Tito. By 1943, Tito's forces had become a formidable threat in the Balkans. Taking advantage of the Allied invasion of Italy and the initial collapse of Mussolini's regime, the Yugoslav partisan leader had expanded his influence, consolidating control over large areas of the countryside. His fighters, adept at guerrilla warfare, regularly disrupted German supply lines, communications, and troop movements. For Berlin, the solution was to decapitate the partisan command by capturing Tito himself. The plan called for a combined airborne and ground assault on his headquarters, believed to be in the mountainous region near Drvar in the Dinaric Alps, an area of rugged terrain in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. Skorzeny was among several senior figures brought into the planning process. However, Operation Knight's Move soon became mired in the same sort of inter-service rivalry that often plagued German special operations. The SS, the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the Luftwaffe, and the regular army all sought to influence the plan and, ultimately, to claim credit for its success. Amid this political infighting, Skorzeny reportedly obtained crucial intelligence while interrogating a captured partisan, information that pointed directly to Tito's headquarters being located in a cave complex outside Drvar. For reasons that remain unclear, Skorzeny did not pass this intelligence along to the rest of the command structure. Around this time, he began distancing himself from the operation altogether, excusing himself from further direct involvement. Whether this was due to disagreements over strategy, doubts about the mission's viability, or simply a calculation that his personal reputation was better protected by staying on the sidelines is a matter of speculation. When the assault finally went ahead in late May 1944, it began with a dramatic airborne landing by German paratroopers and glider troops directly on Drvar. Fierce fighting erupted across the town and surrounding hills, but Tito, warned by the commotion and aided by the mountainous terrain, managed to escape with his closest staff. The partisans melted back into the wilderness, and while the operation inflicted casualties, its primary objective, the capture of Tito, was a failure. For Skorzeny, night's move was a reminder of the fine line between bold planning and overreach, and of the personal rivalries that could cripple even the most ambitious operations. By 1944, the political map of Central and Eastern Europe was beginning to fracture under the pressure of the advancing Allies. In the south, the Western powers had already opened a new front in Italy. To the east, the Red Army was pushing deep into Poland and Ukraine. In the west, the long-anticipated Allied invasion of France was expected at any time. Faced with this three-front crisis, many of Germany's wartime partners began to reconsider their loyalties, and in some cases, take decisive action to change sides. Romania was the first major defection. Once one of Germany's key allies in the invasion of the Soviet Union, supplying vital oil from the Ploiești fields and hundreds of thousands of troops, Romania abruptly switched allegiance in August 1944, joining the Soviets and opening its territory to the Red Army. The change sent shockwaves through Berlin. Adolf Hitler feared that Hungary, a country equally vital for its geographical position and resources, might be the next domino to fall. Hungary had been a formal ally of Germany since the early days of the war, led by Regent Miklos Horthy, the nation's head of state since 1920. But by early 1944, signs of political instability and quiet diplomatic feelers toward the Allies made Hitler deeply suspicious. In March 1944, the Wehrmacht had already moved to preempt any betrayal, launching Operation Margaret to occupy Hungary. Prime Minister Miklos Kale, who had been discreetly exploring a separate peace with the Soviets, was removed from office under German pressure. From that point on, Germany exerted direct control over the country's policies. Despite this tightening grip, Hitler soon discovered that Horthy himself had opened secret negotiations with the Soviets. This time, the German leader resolved to act decisively, replacing Hungary's leadership outright. The man chosen to carry out this political coup was Otto Skorzeny. The mission, codenamed Operation Panzerfaust, Armored Fist, was set in motion in mid-October 1944. Skorzeny, by now commanding the 502nd SS Jäger Battalion, a unit restructured and renamed in late 1943, was ordered to Budapest to remove Horthy from power and secure a pro-German government. On October 15th, Skorzeny's men staged their opening move. They intervened during a scheduled meeting between Horthy's son, Miklos Horthy Jr., and representatives of Tito's Yugoslav partisans, intermediaries in the ongoing talks with Moscow. It was a trap. Skorzeny's forces seized Horthy's son on the spot, hustling him away to Vienna before sending him to Mauthausen concentration camp. News of his son's capture did not deter the regent. That same day, from Castle Hill in Budapest, Horthy took to the radio. In a nationwide broadcast, he declared that Hungary was breaking its alliance with Germany and had agreed to an armistice with the Soviet Union. The announcement was bold, but it came too late. Hitler and Skorzeny had already coordinated with Hungary's Arrow Cross Party, a radical nationalist and ultra-fascist faction, to replace Horthy's government the moment he made his move. Within hours of the regent's broadcast, tanks and SS troops led by Skorzeny surrounded Castle Hill. The display was overwhelming. Horthy's guards, outnumbered and outgunned, were ordered to stand down. In a confrontation that was swift and without bloodshed, Skorzeny entered the regent's quarters and informed him of the situation. Within hours, Horthy was on his way out of Hungary, escorted under SS guard and placed under house arrest in Germany for the remainder of the war. The Arrow Cross took power in Budapest, pledging full support to Berlin even as the Red Army advanced relentlessly toward the Hungarian capital. The coup in Budapest placed the Arrow Cross party under Ferenc Szalasi in power. For Skorzeny, Operation Panzerfaust had been a political strike executed with precision, but even as Hungary was brought under direct German control, events in the West were demanding his attention for a very different kind of mission. If the Grand Sasso raid had made Skorzeny a household name in 1943, there was one other operation that would nearly rival it in fame: Operation Greif. By the autumn of 1944, the Western Allies had broken into France with the D-Day landings in June, swept through Normandy and liberated Paris by late August. Brussels and the vital Belgian port of Antwerp had fallen soon after, and Allied forces were massing for a drive eastward into the Rhineland. To Adolf Hitler, the situation seemed desperate, but not yet beyond all hope. He believed that a decisive blow in the West might shatter Allied momentum, create political turmoil, and perhaps even open the door to a separate peace with Britain and the United States, isolating the Soviet Union. The plan that emerged was the Ardennes Offensive, launched in December 1944. Its aim was to smash through the lightly defended Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg, cross the River Meuse and capture Antwerp, cutting off and encircling large portions of the Allied armies. While the main thrust would be a conventional attack involving hundreds of thousands of troops and armour, Hitler authorized an additional element, a covert operation designed to spread confusion and sabotage the Allied response. For this, he turned again to Otto Skorzeny. The mission was codenamed Operation Greif, Griffin, and its objectives were as unconventional as they were ambitious. Skorzeny was tasked with raising and commanding a special unit, Panzer Brigade 150, composed of German soldiers trained and equipped to operate behind enemy lines disguised as Allied troops. Dressed in American uniforms, driving captured Allied vehicles and speaking English, these operatives would infiltrate the rear areas, seize key road junctions and bridges over the Meuse, sabotage fuel and ammunition depots, and feed false orders to disrupt communications and troop movements. On paper, it was a bold plan. In practice, it was plagued by serious logistical problems from the start. Captured Allied equipment was in short supply. The unit could secure only one operational American Sherman tank. Suitable vehicles like jeeps and trucks had to be scrounged from whatever could be found or salvaged. The language requirement was an even greater obstacle. Fluent English speakers were rare in the German ranks, and those who could mimic an authentic American or British accent were rarer still. To compensate, Skorzeny devised compromises. Where tanks were unavailable, German Panzer IVs were given false silhouettes and painted to resemble American M10 tank destroyers. Each infiltration group would include at least one man who could converse in English well enough to bluff through roadside encounters, while the others would remain silent or speak only briefly to avoid betraying their origin. The risks were high. Any captured German in Allied uniform could be executed as a spy under the laws of war. Operation Greif began on December 16, 1944, the opening day of the Battle of the Bulge. Several dozen of Skorzeny's men slipped through the lines in small teams, fanning out in multiple directions. Their instructions were clear: destroy fuel dumps and ammunition stores where possible, sever communications, turn road signs to mislead troop movements, and spread false orders to sow maximum confusion. The results, while falling short of the grand ambition of capturing bridges over the Meuse, were nonetheless significant. Allied units reported unexpected delays, navigational errors, and mysterious orders that redirected them away from their intended positions. Telephone lines were cut, radio signals disrupted, and fuel deliveries diverted. The psychological effect on the Allies was disproportionate to the small size of Skorzeny's force. Suspicion spread rapidly through the ranks, leading to tighter security checks and even the temporary detention of senior Allied officers until their identities could be confirmed. From his position behind the front, Skorzeny coordinated reports and movements as best he could, but it soon became clear that the primary objective of taking Meuse crossings was out of reach. The German advance was slowing under stiff Allied resistance, and the window for deep penetration was closing. Still, Operation Greif had achieved a measure of success, not through dramatic battlefield victories, but by forcing the Allies to look over their shoulders and second-guess every order, road sign and checkpoint in their rear areas. In the early days of Operation Greif, the deception worked better than even Skorzeny might have anticipated. His disguised teams roamed the Ardennes, not only turning signposts but actively feeding false orders to unsuspecting Allied formations. In several cases, entire brigades were redirected down the wrong roads, delaying reinforcements and disrupting carefully laid operational plans. One team even managed to convince an Allied detachment to abandon a village it had already secured, simply by posing as higher-ranking officers and delivering fabricated orders to withdraw. The confusion this caused rippled outward, forcing Allied commanders to divert time and manpower to re-establish control over positions they thought were safe. Yet, such an elaborate ruse could only last so long. Within days, the Allies realized that German commandos in American uniforms were operating behind their lines. New security measures were put in place, most notably an expanding network of checkpoints where every soldier, regardless of rank, was subject to questioning. But in the paranoia that followed, the cure often proved as disruptive as the disease. One now famous incident involved U.S. General Omar Bradley. Stopped at a checkpoint, Bradley was asked the capital of Illinois by an alert, if overconfident, sentry. Bradley correctly answered Springfield, but the soldier was convinced the capital was Chicago and promptly had one of the most senior American officers on the front detained on suspicion of being one of Skorzeny's men. Even Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was not spared from the chaos. While driving in his jeep, his vehicle came under fire from nervous Allied troops, who feared that Monty might actually be a German imposter. The wheels of his jeep were shot out before the mistake was realized. These incidents underscored how much disruption Skorzeny's small force had caused in just a short span of time. Allied troops were suddenly suspicious of anyone, even their own leaders. However, the strategic tide could not be turned by deception alone. By late December 1944, the German offensive in the Ardennes was faltering. On December 26th, US General George Patton's Third Army arrived in force, breaking the siege of Bastogne and driving the German counterattack into retreat. With the failure of the Battle of the Bulge, the initiative in the west was gone for good. The Allies began their final push toward the Rhine, while in the east, the Red Army was massing in northwestern Poland for its decisive advance into Germany and toward Berlin. The endgame had begun. Inside the Nazi leadership, some were already thinking beyond the inevitable military collapse. Heinrich Himmler, Skorzeny's superior within the SS, tentatively explored possible peace contacts with the Western Allies, though the chances of reaching terms acceptable to either side were slim. At the same time, Himmler pursued a darker contingency plan, one he had been developing since the autumn of 1944, Operation Werwolf. The goal was to train small, fanatically loyal bands of SS personnel and Nazi Party members to continue fighting after Germany's occupation, waging a campaign of sabotage, assassination and intimidation against the victorious Allies. It would be a form of guerrilla warfare intended to keep the Nazi cause alive, even without a state to defend it. Skorzeny was brought into the planning. In the early months of 1945, he supervised the training of hundreds of selected operatives. The curriculum was intense and uncompromising. Long-range sniping, demolition techniques, sabotage of transport and communications, manufacturing improvised explosives, and methods for operating in small, clandestine cells without detection. The idea was to create a network of covert fighters capable of acting independently in occupied Germany for months, even years, after the war officially ended. It was a mission perfectly suited to Skorzeny's expertise in unconventional warfare. Yet, as events would soon prove, the collapse of Germany in the spring of 1945 would come so swiftly and completely that Operation Werwolf would never become the sustained underground movement its planners envisioned. Exactly how far Operation Werwolf progressed before the German surrender remains a subject of considerable debate among historians. There is no question that it was a genuine SS program. Training, facilities, and even limited deployments did occur, but modern scholarship tends to view it as far more limited in scope than wartime rumors suggested. While Nazi propaganda painted it as the blueprint for a vast underground guerrilla army ready to bleed the Allies dry after occupation, the reality appears to have been far less organized, more aspirational than practical. For Skorzeny, the Werewolf Initiative was only one of many competing demands on his attention in the war's chaotic final months. In late January 1945, the shortage of experienced field commanders had become so acute that he was reassigned from covert operations to a more conventional military role. He was given command of a formation within the German 3rd Panzer Army and sent to defend the Schwedt bridgehead in northeastern Germany, a strategic position on the Oder River. Here, the Soviet Second Belarusian Front was pushing relentlessly westward, aiming for Berlin. Skorzeny, accustomed to special missions with small, highly trained units, now faced the very different challenge of holding a defensive position against overwhelming numbers. His resources were meagre, heavy machine guns and artillery were in critically short supply. Improvisation became essential. In one notable adaptation, he mounted anti-aircraft guns on the backs of trucks to serve as mobile fire platforms, using them in a direct fire role against ground targets. Despite the odds, Skorzeny's forces held Schwedt for 31 days, from early February until March 3rd. The withdrawal he ordered was not the result of a battlefield collapse, but of strategic prudence, with no fresh orders from higher command and the threat of encirclement growing by the day. He judged it wiser to pull back while his force was still intact. From there, his movements reflected the rapidly disintegrating German front. Briefly sent westward, he was tasked with overseeing the demolition or sabotage of bridges over the Rhine to slow the Allied advance. The assignment was short-lived, and soon he was back in Berlin, where the Red Army's tightening noose had brought the war to the city's very streets. It was during this period, in one of his last meetings with Adolf Hitler, that Skorzeny was awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross, the highest decoration available in Nazi Germany. He never received the physical insignia. Within days, he had left Berlin, heading south toward Austria. It was here that the news reached him. On April 30th, Hitler had taken his own life in Berlin. Just over a week later, came confirmation that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The idea of prolonging the fight in the mountains was quickly dismissed by Skorzeny and other senior SS officers in the region. Supplies were inadequate, the troops exhausted, and the political leadership gone. There was even talk, fanciful but revealing of the mood, that the SS could offer their services to the Allies as a kind of security force in post-war Germany, helping maintain order against perceived threats from the east. On May 16, 1945, Skorzeny, accompanied by several other high-ranking SS commanders, descended from the mountains and surrendered to an American division. Given his notoriety, both as the man who rescued Mussolini and the organizer of daring operations behind Allied lines, it seemed inevitable that he would be swiftly interrogated and placed on the list of high-profile defendants for the upcoming International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Many senior Nazis were dead by suicide or in battle. In the eyes of the Allies, Skorzeny was exactly the kind of visible, recognizable figure they might want to put on trial. At first glance, it seemed inevitable that Otto Skorzeny would face the full weight of post-war justice. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Himmler's successor as head of the SS, stood before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg following Himmler's suicide. Surely Skorzeny, the man who had pulled Mussolini from an Alpine prison, who was rumoured to have plotted the assassination of Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, and who had commanded one of the most notorious deception operations of the war, would also be placed in the dock for one of the major trials. But that never happened. Still, complete avoidance of trial was impossible. In early 1946, the decision was made to try him at Dachau. The irony was not lost on observers. This was the very site of the first major concentration camp established by the Nazis in the mid-1930s to imprison their political enemies. Now it had been repurposed as a courtroom where hundreds of SS officers and other Nazi figures would be judged. His stay there was brief. Following further review by senior American and British intelligence officers, it was decided that Skorzeny should instead be transferred to Nuremberg for more detailed proceedings. Once at Nuremberg, he was interrogated repeatedly over a period of months, the questioning focusing heavily on his role in Operation Greif and other special missions. The Allies were particularly interested in the Ardennes offensive, and a rumor that he had been supplied with bullets laced with aconitine, a deadly plant-based toxin, before the operation began. If proven, it could have been classified as an act of chemical warfare. These months were punishing for Skorzeny. He spent long stretches in solitary confinement and suffered recurring health problems. In protest over the conditions, he began a hunger strike, which only worsened his physical state. By late 1946, his situation had deteriorated to the point that he was returned to Dachau, where surgeons removed his gallbladder. It was not until the summer of 1947 that formal charges were finally brought against him. The case centered on his actions during Operation Greif, accusing him of violating the laws of war by sending troops behind enemy lines disguised in American uniforms. The trial, held in the late summer and early autumn, was closely watched. Skorzeny's name still carried a certain notoriety among both former comrades and his Allied captors. But from the outset, the prosecution's case was fragile. Under cross-examination, it became clear that the Allies themselves had contemplated similar deception tactics during the war. When Allied officers testified that they had made plans comparable to those executed by Skorzeny in the Ardennes, the legal foundation for the charges all but collapsed. The verdict in the autumn of 1947 was a surprise to many. Otto Skorzeny was acquitted. The courtroom that had expected to see one of the Reich's most recognizable commando leaders convicted instead watched him walk free, at least on paper. In reality, there was no freedom waiting for him beyond the dock. As the months passed and 1947 turned into 1948, Skorzeny remained in custody, now facing a different process entirely: denazification. This was not about individual battlefield actions, but about determining his role within the broader Nazi system and deciding whether he could be safely released back into post-war German society. For a man with his record, the likely outcome was years more imprisonment. By the summer of 1948, however, Skorzeny had been in detention for more than 3 years, and he was not prepared to spend several more behind bars. That summer, he escaped. The circumstances of his disappearance were, and remain, clouded in mystery. In his later years, Skorzeny, never shy about embellishing his own legend, claimed that elements within the US authorities had quietly assisted him in slipping away, perhaps recognizing his military talents in the early days of the Cold War. Yet there is no credible evidence to support this version of events. For the next year and a half, Skorzeny lived in hiding in Bavaria. His refuge was a farm rented by Countess Ilse Luthia, a niece of Hjalmar Schacht, the former Reich finance minister and president of the Reichsbank. The Countess became more than just his protector, she became his partner. After securing a divorce from his second wife, Skorzeny married Luthia. When he next surfaced publicly, it was 1950 in Paris. A photographer spotted him in a cafe, and the resulting image confirmed to the world that the man once considered one of the most dangerous commandos of the war was alive and moving freely. Skorzeny did not wait around for the reaction. He slipped out of the French capital, made his way into Austria, and soon after turned his attention to a more permanent refuge. In 1951, he found it in Francoist Spain. Although officially neutral during the Second World War, the regime of General Francisco Franco and the Falange political movement was ideologically sympathetic to many former Axis figures. Spain became a haven for ex-Nazis, particularly those with the right connections. For Skorzeny, it offered safety from extradition and a platform for a new life. Settling in Madrid, he lived under the guise of respectability, claiming to work as a journalist or an import-export, occupations vague enough to deflect casual inquiry. But behind this facade, Skorzeny was becoming a central figure in a covert network of former SS officers and Nazi loyalists operating across Western Europe. The network Skorzeny built after his escape soon gained a name that would stick: Die Spinne, or the Spider. Operating first from Bavaria in the immediate aftermath of his break from custody, it began as a small, tight-knit circle of trusted contacts providing shelter, funds, and forged documents to wanted members of the SS. Within a few years, it had grown into a sprawling, loosely coordinated escape organization. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Die Spinne provided a lifeline to hundreds of fugitives. From safe houses in Germany and Austria, its routes led across the Swiss border, then south into Italy and Spain, before continuing on to far-flung destinations in South America, Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay chief among them. In some cases, the network didn't just facilitate escapes, it actively engineered them. There were even instances where SS prisoners were broken out of detention facilities inside Germany, smuggled through friendly contacts, and placed on the rat line to freedom. By 1951, the Spider had secured the backing of one of the most powerful industrial names in post-war Germany, Alfred Krupp. Krupp, a steel magnate whose factories had been central to the Nazi war machine and who had profited from forced labor during the Holocaust, had been sentenced to 12 years at Nuremberg. Yet he had served only 3 before his early release in 1950, part of a broader Western policy of reintegrating key industrialists into the rebuilding of West Germany. Krupp's cooperation proved invaluable to Skorzeny. Through the Krupp company's far-reaching business connections across Europe and South America, Die Spinne could arrange more secure transport, acquire more convincing documentation, and move its operatives and fugitives more efficiently along the escape routes. With such resources, Skorzeny's operation became one of the most effective clandestine exfiltration networks of its era. His first years in Madrid were equally active in the public sphere. Seeking to capitalize on his wartime reputation, and perhaps to shape the narrative before others did, Skorzeny began writing his memoirs. He knew the market was there. In the final years of the war, Allied propaganda had dubbed him the most dangerous man in Europe, a label that, while exaggerated, ensured his name carried a certain infamy. The French daily Le Figaro, one of the country's most prominent newspapers since the 19th century, secured the rights to serialize his account. But if Skorzeny had anticipated controversy, even he might not have predicted the scale of the reaction. On April 5, 1950, as the first installments appeared, more than 1,500 French communists descended on Le Figaro's Paris offices in protest. The demonstration rapidly escalated into a street battle with hundreds of gendarmes, a clash as much about Cold War tensions as it was about the man whose words had sparked it. By this time, the West's priorities were shifting. With the Cold War intensifying, former Nazi officers and collaborators were no longer viewed solely as war criminals, but as potential assets against the Soviet Union. In West Germany, tens of thousands of men who had once served the Reich in the military, industry, or administration were officially deemed entnazifisiert, denazified, pardoned, or quietly released from prison. Many were soon employed by the new government or by Western intelligence agencies. Skorzeny benefited from this climate. In 1952, he was formally declared denazified in absentia, despite still living abroad and never returning to take up residence in Germany. From that point on, he travelled under a Nansen passport, a refugee travel document, which allowed him considerable freedom of movement across Europe and beyond. While Madrid was his base, Skorzeny was not the sort of man to remain idle. He travelled extensively, cultivated political and business contacts, and became an influential figure among the post-war community of exiled former SS officers, nationalists, and right-wing networks that crisscrossed Europe. For him, the war had ended in 1945, but the struggle in his mind had simply entered a different phase. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Otto Skorzeny's life became a constant movement between continents, a mixture of business ventures, political networking, clandestine work, and occasional controversy. Despite his notoriety, he travelled freely under his Nansen passport, often blurring the line between legitimate consultancy work and covert political activity. One country that particularly drew his interest was Ireland. The island nation, having remained neutral during the Second World War, was not entirely hostile to the idea of former Axis figures residing there, a position rooted partly in its historic mistrust of Britain. In the second half of the 1950s, Skorzeny purchased an extensive farm in County Kildare. He spent long stretches there, enjoying the relative quiet and anonymity that rural Ireland could provide. Yet, despite his investment, the Irish authorities stopped short of allowing him permanent settlement. When he applied for a visa to remain indefinitely, the government quietly but firmly refused, wary of the publicity and diplomatic repercussions that might follow. From Ireland, his travels often took him much farther afield. Argentina was a recurring destination. Under President Juan Perón, the country had opened its doors to former Nazis and Axis collaborators, seeing them as useful in strengthening Argentina's industrial, military, and political base. Skorzeny was not just welcomed, but openly entertained by Perón himself, a testament to the web of connections he still enjoyed among leaders sympathetic to his past. Another significant posting came in the mid-1950s when Skorzeny worked in Egypt. Following the 1952 coup led by General Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt sought to modernize its armed forces and reduce British influence. Skorzeny was brought in to help train Egyptian military units, applying his wartime expertise to a very different theatre. While the full extent of his role is still debated, it is possible that some of the troops he trained were later involved in the seizure of the British-held Suez Canal zone, a move that triggered the Suez Crisis of 1956 and reshaped the geopolitics of the Middle East. Even while advising foreign governments, Skorzeny maintained deep ties to the far-right networks in Europe. In Spain, where Francisco Franco's regime tolerated and in some cases quietly supported fascist revivalist activity, he was among the founding members of CEDADE, the Círculo Español de Amigos de Europa, Spanish Circle of Friends of Europe. Established in 1966, CEDADE sought to keep fascist ideology alive during a period when Spain was cautiously opening to Western liberal influence. Skorzeny was more than a figurehead. He acted as a senior advisor within its leadership, lending his organizational skill and international connections to the movement. Perhaps his most ambitious post-war venture came in 1970 with the creation of the Paladin Group. Conceived as a neo-fascist paramilitary organization based in Spain, Paladin offered security consulting and quasi-mercenary services to right-wing governments and regimes. Its purpose was clear: to counter the rise of left-wing insurgencies, communist guerrilla movements, and urban militant groups that had begun spreading across Western Europe in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Paladin Group's activities remain shrouded in mystery. What is known is that they operated firmly on the anti-communist side of the Cold War divide. Paladin is believed to have cooperated with Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's right-wing government in Portugal and with conservative elements in Italy during the turbulent Years of Lead. There is also evidence to suggest the group provided training to Arab militant factions in Egypt for operations against Israel. However, more sensational claims, such as Paladin having trained US Special Forces for deployment in Indochina, remain unsubstantiated and are generally dismissed by historians as lacking credible evidence. By this time, Skorzeny had transformed himself into something more than just the celebrated commando of 1943. He had become a broker of military expertise, an ideological organizer, and a shadowy facilitator in the network of post-war far-right movements, a man whose wartime fame continued to open doors even in the most unexpected places. The closing years of Otto Skorzeny's life brought perhaps the most unexpected twist in a career already filled with improbable turns. In 1989, long after his death, reports began circulating from within Israeli intelligence circles that in the mid-1960s, the former SS commando had been recruited by none other than Mossad, Israel's national intelligence agency. At first glance, the claim seemed almost too outlandish to be credible, a headline designed to shock rather than inform. Yet the story was publicly confirmed by a former senior Mossad administrator, and, over the years, further investigation by journalists and historians has added weight to the possibility. The details remain murky, and the truth is still debated. Some accounts suggest that Mossad agents appeared at Skorzeny's home in Spain, and under threat of assassination, compelled him to work for them. The aim, according to this version, was to help Israel disrupt the transfer of German military technology and expertise to Egypt at a time when the two nations were locked in a series of conflicts. Another theory holds that Skorzeny's work for Mossad was conducted through intermediaries, and that he may never have realized who was ultimately directing his assignments. A third possibility, perhaps the most intriguing, proposes that, following the capture and execution of Adolf Eichmann in the early 1960s, Skorzeny struck a private deal with Israeli operatives. He would assist them in undermining Egypt's military build-up in exchange for immunity from pursuit. Whatever the reality, this strange episode stands as one of the more curious codas to his career. A former Nazi commando, celebrated by his peers for missions like the Gran Sasso raid, allegedly aiding the intelligence service of the Jewish state. Not long after this supposed connection, Skorzeny's health began to falter. In 1970, he was diagnosed with a malignant tumor on his spine. At the time, spinal surgery was a far more invasive procedure than it is today, and his operation in Hamburg left him temporarily paralyzed. Although he regained his mobility, the cancer continued its relentless spread, eventually reaching his lungs. On 5th of July 1975, Otto Skorzeny died in Madrid at the age of 67. His funeral, much like his life, was mired in controversy. Conducted as a Roman Catholic ceremony in the Spanish capital, it drew a sizable crowd of mourners, including many former SS members and committed National Socialists. Several gave the Hitler salute openly during the proceedings. After the service, his body was cremated and the ashes returned to Vienna, where they were interred in the Skorzeny family plot. A second ceremony in Austria mirrored the first, attracting another assembly of ex-SS men and neo-Nazis, all under the watchful eye of plainclothes Austrian police. Even in death, Skorzeny remained a polarizing figure, admired by some for his military daring, condemned by others for the cause he had served. And so, this brings us to the end of Otto Skorzeny's story, a life that stretched from SS commando raids in Europe to shadowy dealings in Egypt and even whispers of work with Mossad. His tale is as extraordinary as it is controversial, and it remains one of the most unusual legacies of the Second World War. If you want to hear more stories like this, of soldiers, battles, and the hidden chapters of history, be sure to subscribe and join us again for the next documentary. Thank you.